I had barely finished unpacking when the HOA stormed onto my cabin land, demanding I hand it over. What they didn't know was I was actually their landlord. The boxes were still stacked by the door, my coffee still steaming on the porch railing. When I saw them coming up the gravel path, 3 people in pressed suits, clipboards in hand, walking with the kind of authority that assumes compliance before a word is spoken. The tallest one, a man with a sharp jaw and a sharper tone, didn't even bother with introductions. "You can't be here," he said, as if my very existence on my own porch was an offense. I blinked at him, still holding the mug. "Excuse me, this cabin," he gestured broadly, "is in violation of HOA regulations. Cabins aren't permitted on this land. You'll need to vacate immediately." I almost laughed. I'd been here less than 48 hours, and already the peace I'd sought was being shattered. I'd moved here for quiet, away from the city's constant hum, away from the endless meetings and deadlines. The cabin was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where the only interruptions came from the wind in the pines or the occasional deer wandering past. Instead, I was being told to leave by people who didn't even live here. I didn't argue. Yet, I simply nodded, as though I were taking their words under serious consideration, and watched them march back down the path. The gravel crunched under their polished shoes, and I wondered if they'd ever actually walked these woods for pleasure, or if they only came here to enforce rules. That night, I sat by the fire and thought about what they'd said. Cabins not allowed? That was absurd. I'd bought this land outright, cabin included. The paperwork was airtight. But I also knew enough about people like this to understand that arguing too soon only made them dig in deeper. The next morning, my neighbor, a wiry man named Tom with a weathered face and a kind smile, stopped by. "Heard the HOA came knocking," he said, leaning on the porch railing. "Word travels fast," I replied. "They're ruthless," he warned. "They find people for having the wrong color curtains. They'll make your life hell if you don't play along." I thanked him for the warning, but inside I was already forming a plan. I'd dealt with bullies before, different settings, same tactics. The trick was to let them think they were winning, right up until the moment they realized they'd been playing the wrong game. Over the next week, the visits became more frequent. First, a letter slipped under my door, citing multiple violations and threatening daily fines. Then, 2 more board members showed up, this time with a printed packet of HOA bylaws, highlighting the sections they claimed I was breaking. I read every word, slowly, deliberately, and I noticed something interesting nowhere. In their bylaws, did it actually say cabins were prohibited? They were relying on interpretation, not fact. I kept my expression neutral, thanked them for their time, and closed the door. By the 3rd week, they'd escalated to threats of legal action. I received a certified letter stating that if I didn't remove the cabin within 30 days, they would pursue all available remedies. I still didn't fight back. Not yet. Instead, I started gathering my own documents, property deeds, land surveys, tax records. And then I pulled out the one file I knew would end this entire charade: the ownership papers for the very land their HOA office sat on. It was almost poetic. Years ago, I'd invested in a few parcels of land in this area, never thinking much of it. One of those parcels, as it turned out, was leased to the HOA for their office building and the common spaces they so proudly controlled. They paid rents quietly, automatically every month, never realizing the man they were now harassing was the one cashing their checks. I decided to let them keep digging. The deeper they went, the sweeter the reveal would be. One evening, I attended their special neighborhood meeting where they planned to address ongoing violations. The room was packed, neighbors sitting in folding chairs, the board members at a long table up front. The same sharp-jawed man from my first day stood and began listing my supposed offenses, his voice dripping with self-importance. When he finished, I stood, calm, steady, and I pulled a folder from under my arm. "I appreciate your concern for my property," I said, "but I think there's been a misunderstanding." I laid the documents on the table in front of them. "Not only do I own my cabin and the land it sits on, but I also own the land your office occupies. Which means, technically, I'm your landlord." The silence that followed was almost musical. A few neighbors gasped. Someone in the back chuckled. The board members stared at the papers, their faces draining of color. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply said, "I suggest we find a way to coexist peacefully. Otherwise, I might have to reconsider your lease terms." That was the moment the tide turned. And that, as they say, was just the beginning. The meeting ended in a stunned silence, but the ripple it sent through the neighborhood was immediate. By the time I walked back to my cabin, the story had already begun to spread. Neighbors who had barely made eye contact before were now stopping. Me on the path, shaking my hand, whispering their own grievances about the HOA. It was as if my reveal had cracked open a dam. People who had been quietly enduring fines, warnings, and petty harassment suddenly realized they weren't alone, that the board's power wasn't as absolute as they'd been led to believe. The next morning, I found a small basket of fresh bread on my porch with a note. "Thank you for standing up to them. We've been waiting for someone to do it." No signature, but I had a feeling it came from one of the older couples who lived near the lake. The HOA, however, didn't take the blow quietly. Within days, I received another letter, this one far more carefully worded. They acknowledged my ownership of the land their office occupied, but insisted that all residents must still comply with community standards. It was a thinly veiled attempt to reassert control. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I started walking the neighborhood more often, talking to people, listening to their stories. I learned about the single mother fined for having a swing set too close to her fence. The retired veteran who had been ordered to repaint his shed 3 times in 1 year because the shade of green wasn't consistent. The young couple who had been threatened with eviction for keeping chickens, even though the bylaws didn't forbid it. Every story added fuel to the quiet fire building in the community. Meanwhile, the board began to unravel. I heard whispers of heated arguments during their closed-door meetings. One of the members, a woman named Carol, resigned abruptly, citing irreconcilable differences. Another, a man who had been on the board for over a decade, stopped showing up entirely. Then came the day they tried to flex their authority one last time. I was splitting firewood behind the cabin when a black SUV pulled up. Out stepped the sharp-jawed president, flanked by 2 others. They didn't bother with pleasantries. "We've decided to terminate our lease on the office property," he said, his voice tight. "We'll be moving operations elsewhere." I set down the axe and wiped my hands on my jeans. "That's your choice," I said evenly. "But you should know the lease has a 2-year minimum notice clause. You break it early, you pay the penalty." His jaw tightened further. "We'll fight it." I smiled. "You're welcome to try. But I'd suggest reading the contract first." I wrote it myself. They left without another word. That night, I sat on the porch, the air cool and still, and thought about how quickly power shifts when people stop being afraid. The HOA had built its authority on intimidation and assumption. The moment those crumbled, so did their control. Over the next few weeks, the board's presence in the neighborhood all but vanished. The letters stopped. The unannounced visits ceased. People began fixing up their homes without fear of fines. Kids played in yards without someone measuring fence heights. And yet, I knew this wasn't over. Not completely. The president still had allies. And I could feel the tension lingering like a storm that hadn't quite passed. I decided it was time to take the next step, not just defending my own peace, but making sure no one else here would have to fight this battle again. That meant going after the HOA itself. The decision to take down the HOA wasn't made in anger, it was made in clarity. I'd seen enough of their tactics to know that if they weren't stopped, they'd simply regroup and find another target. And I wasn't about to let that happen. To my neighbors, the first step was quiet. I began meeting with residents one-on-one, over coffee at my cabin or during slow walks along the wooded trails. I listened more than I spoke. People needed to feel heard before they'd be ready to act. And the stories they told, they were worse than I'd imagined. One man had been fined for planting tomatoes in his front yard because vegetable gardens were unsightly. Another had been ordered to remove a small wooden bench from his porch because it didn't match the community aesthetic. These weren't rules, they were weapons, used to control and humiliate. I started keeping a ledger. Every story, every fine, every letter. Dates, amounts, names. It was meticulous work, but I knew that when the time came, this record would be my hammer. The second step was building trust. I made it clear that I wasn't just fighting for myself. I told them about the lease, about how the HOA's office sat on my land, and how that gave me leverage. I didn't promise miracles, but I promised I wouldn't back down. Soon, small gatherings began to form, neighbors meeting in living rooms, garages, even around campfires. We talked about what a fair, functional community could look like. We discussed bylaws, voting rights, and the process for removing board members. The more people learned, the more they realized the HOA's power wasn't absolute, it was borrowed. And it could be taken back. The board must have sensed the shift, because they tried to reassert control. Flyers appeared on doors, warning residents about false information being spread. They accused me without naming me of undermining community harmony. It backfired. People who had been indifferent before started asking questions. And when they asked me, I didn't give them speech. I showed them documents. I showed them the lease, the bylaws, the fines that had no legal basis. Facts, not rumors. Then came the turning point. One evening, Tom, the neighbor who had first warned me about the HOA, knocked on my door. "They're calling an emergency meeting," he said. "Tomorrow night. Word is, they're going to try to vote you out of the community." I smiled. Perfect. The next night, the community hall was packed. The board sat at their table, papers neatly stacked, faces tight with determination. The president launched into a speech about protecting the integrity of the neighborhood and removing disruptive influences. When he finished, I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I've listened to your accusations," I said, "and I've respected your process. But now, I think it's time everyone here knows the full truth." I opened my ledger and began reading. Case after case, fine after fine, each one more absurd than the last. I named names, dates, amounts. I showed letters, photographs, receipts. And then I laid down the lease agreement for all to see. "This," I said, tapping the paper, "is the land your HOA office sits on. Own it. And if this board continues to abuse its authority, I will terminate your lease and lock the doors. You will have no office, no meeting space, and no legal standing to operate here." The room erupted not in chaos, but in applause. Neighbors stood, clapping, cheering. The board members looked like they'd swallowed glass. I didn't push for a vote that night. I didn't need to. The momentum was already shifting. The people had seen the truth, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. That night, walking back to my cabin under the glow of the porch light, I knew the end game was in motion. The HOA's days were numbered. The days after the emergency meeting felt different. The air in the neighborhood had shifted lighter, freer, but beneath it all was a current of anticipation. People were waiting for the next move, and I knew it had to be decisive. I wasn't. Interested in a drawn-out Cold War with the HOA, I wanted a clean break. A permanent change that would make it impossible for another group of petty tyrants to take their place. That meant dismantling the board from the inside out. The first step was to trigger a recall election, according to the bylaws ironically. It's the same ones they'd used to harass so many residents. A certain percentage of homeowners signed a petition the board could be removed entirely. I drafted the petition, kept the language simple, and started walking door to door. It didn't take long. People were eager to sign, some even offering to help gather more names. Within a week, we had more than double the required signatures. The board tried to stall, claiming the petition was invalid due to formatting errors. That's when I reminded them publicly that their office lease was still in my hands. The recall vote was scheduled for the following month. In the meantime, I kept the pressure on. I filed a formal notice of lease review, which meant the HOA had to provide me with a full accounting of their use of the property. It was a legal requirement they'd never had to deal with before, and it sent them scrambling. Every hour they spent digging through their own paperwork was an hour they weren't harassing residents. The night of the recall vote, the community hall was overflowing. People stood in the back, leaning against walls, the air buzzing with quiet excitement. The board members sat stiffly at their table, avoiding eye contact. The vote wasn't even close. One by one, the ballots were counted, and with each tally, the outcome became clearer. By the end, the board was going every seat vacated. A cheer went up, loud and unrestrained. Neighbors hugged, laughed, and for the first time since I'd arrived, the place felt like a real community in the weeks that followed. We formed a new association, not an HOA in the traditional sense, but a cooperative council with limited powers and a focus on maintaining shared spaces without policing people's lives. The rules were simple, fair, and voted on by everyone. The old HOA office. I terminated their lease and converted the building into a community center. Now, instead of a place where fines were issued and threats were made, it became a space for potlucks, game nights, and town discussions. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat on my porch with Tom. The cabin glowed in the warm light. The air filled with the sound of kids playing somewhere down the road. You know. Tom said, "I think you saved this place." I shook my head. No, we all did. I just gave them a reason to stand up. And in that moment, I realized the real victory wasn't in owning the land or winning the fight, was in watching a community reclaim its voice. The weeks after the recall felt like the first days of spring after a long, bitter winter. The air seemed lighter, conversations warmer. People waved when they passed, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to. The tension that had once hung over the neighborhood like a low gray cloud was gone. The new community council settled in quickly. Meetings were open, decisions transparent, and rules were kept to a minimum just enough to keep shared spaces safe and maintained, without intruding into people's private lives. The difference was night and day. The old HOA office, now the community center, became the heart of the neighborhood. On Friday nights, the smell of barbecue drifted from its patio. Kids sprawled on the grass playing tag while parents chatted over coffee. The same building that had once been a symbol of control and intimidation was now a place of laughter and connection. One evening, I stood at the edge of the gathering, watching it all. Tom came up beside me, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He handed me one without a word. We stood there for a while, just taking it in the sound of music playing softly from a speaker. The sight of neighbors who had once avoided each other, now sharing stories and food. "You know," Tom said finally, "this place feels alive again." I nodded. "It's because people stopped being afraid. They realized they had the power all along." He smiled. "And you gave them the push they needed." I didn't argue, but I knew the truth. That wasn't just me. It was every person who signed that petition, every neighbor who spoke up, every resident who decided enough was enough. I'd just been the spark. Later that night, back at my cabin, I sat on the porch with the crickets singing in the dark. The cabin's windows glowed warmly, the scent of pine drifting in on the breeze. I thought about the day I'd arrived, coffee in hand, facing down 3 strangers who thought they could take what was mine. I thought about the patience it had taken to wait, to let them dig their own hole before I revealed the truth, and I thought about the lesson I'd leave behind, just for this neighborhood. But for anyone who's ever been pushed around by people who mistake authority for power, never mistake kindness for weakness, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards. The cabin stood quiet under the fading light, its wooden walls glowing gold in the sunset. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the laughter of neighbors somewhere down the road. Sound that once would have been drowned out by tension and fear. I leaned back in my chair, the porch boards warm beneath my feet, and let the stillness settle in. This land, this home, this piece, it was mine. Not because I fought the loudest, but because I waited, watched, and chose my moment. The HOA had come here certain they could take what they wanted. They left with nothing but the echo of their own arrogance and the people they once ruled. They now stood together, stronger than before. I took a slow sip of coffee, the steam curling into the cool evening air, and smiled. Kindness is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards. Out here, in the shadow of the trees, I'd found more than just a cabin. I'd found proof that truth once revealed can't be silenced. And that's a lesson no one here will ever forget.